our Bordeaux Summit, Bordeaux En Primeur, and COVID-19. So I'd just like to introduce you to our panelists, if you're not familiar with them. We have Gavin Quinney, who has been reporting on vintages out in Bordeaux for Jancis Robinson, for Liv-Ex and others for a number of years, and is the owner of Château Bauduc, and is in his 20th vintage. So, perfect. There we go. Thank you, Nathan. Nick, as you can see, Director of Wine Owners, Fine Wine Trading Exchange, peer-to-peer platform. A lot of experience as a collector and setting up this exchange as well. And Rupert Miller, who is the Fine Wine editor and also the Hong Kong editor of the Drinks Business magazine as well. And my business partner and co-founder of Honest Grapes, Nathan, is with us, and Charlie, who manages our Grand Cru Classé club as well. So without further ado, I will very briefly, for those who aren't aware, explain the En Primeur system, and then I'm going to hand over to Gavin. So for those who aren't aware, the En Primeur system in Bordeaux is quite distinctive, and traditionally it was the way in which the Bordelais would sell their wines through to the trade, and the chateaux would release a percentage, if not all, of their wines to the négociants. The négociants then sell their wine to merchants like Honest Grapes, and then we sell the wines to you. This was traditionally considered the best method for the release of new wines. It allowed chateaux to recoup a certain percentage of the costs of that year's harvest. It also utilized the négociants' far more extensive network of contacts in order to be able to sell their wines more broadly. Of course, what it does do is put a number of links in the chain between chateau owner and wine consumer. So I think that's enough on the background of both En Primeur and the current system. And I'd like to turn now to Nathan. In fact, I beg your pardon, we'll do Nathan before Gavin, because we're now going to have the results of our expert survey, which we sent out to a number of trade professionals, press, chateau owners. Nathan, perhaps you could talk us through this first, give us some background. Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much, Tom. So I'm Nathan Hill. I'm co-founder of Honest Grapes with Tom. I'm going to present the preliminary outcomes of two surveys, a smaller survey that we've done with trade experts, and then a larger one with over 100 responses from all of us, people who love collecting wine, particularly Bordeaux. And for all of you today and people who couldn't come along, we're going to be publishing the results of this survey in about a week's time, together with our findings. So these are preliminary results at the moment. I'm going to quickly canter through the shorter survey. So 35 trade experts, about 8 of them from the French side, so producers, négociants, 15 merchants and brokers in London, and 12 of them journalists or critics. And the first question we asked them was, is Bordeaux becoming a more or less important part of the fine wine scene? And it's fairly clear, and you see this in publicity around the trade, that since the great sort of peak of 2009, 2010, 2011, Bordeaux has become less important, and it's decreased in trading terms from 96 to about 50 to 55%. And you can see that picture coming from those 35 people. We then asked, given COVID-19 and the postponement, as Tom's explained the system, normally about 2 weeks ago, the experts, critics, Tom and co would have gone out to Bordeaux to taste the wines, and that hasn't happened. And that means there are no critics' reviews and there's no release of the wines yet. And so there's a big debate going on. When should wines be released? And we'll be discussing that in the panel in a moment. And more than 2/3 of these respondents said it's time for change, and about 1/3 said no, it should stay the same. And guess what? The people who said it should stay the same are the French. They're the people sitting on Gavin's side of the channel there. I'm not going to name names, but I know who you are and I've got the comments. Then what we did, and I'm going to show you the expert's view matched with the collector's view, we asked but the same question, both of experts and wine lovers. Now, given where we are with the lockdown and everything in France now extended to the 11th of May, and here we'll have an announcement in the next few days, clearly to extend it further, when should Bordeaux 19 be released? And on the left-hand side, in a sort of light blue, greyish blue, are what the experts say, and the Bordeaux lovers I've put on the right-hand side in brown. And you can see only 8% of people are saying it should be launched now. You can see the people on the sales side, the negotiants and suppliers, are champing at the bit. About a third of them want to launch in July. And I was in discussion with people today talking about sending samples to us. And then clearly collectors are saying, please, can you put this off? And we'll discuss this in the panel session about should Bordeaux become a little bit more like, well, maybe not, if not like Italy, at least get wine that's a bit better assembled and towards being in bottle. But so you can see a bigger push from collectors towards saying, wait a while, let's wait for things to settle down and for the wine to be more mature. I then asked our 35 experts what price Bordeaux should be released at, Bordeaux 2019 compared with 18. And we'll have a discussion about the quality of 19 versus 18. They picked up particularly from the Négociant and Bordelais concern over the demand side. And as you can see here, about a third of the Bordelais are looking at roughly level prices, -5 to +5%. More than half are talking about 5% or even 10% lower, and only a small proportion, 14%, talking about higher prices. And we'll have this discussion with the panel, but that was very clearly from the comments that the people gave us that we'll publish in the survey, although anonymized, of course. There is a definitely interest in the vintage, but concern over whether we as wine collectors would actually want to pay the price. And so a feeling at the moment that they'll probably have to price a bit lower. I will now stop the share and we can move to the panel session.
Thanks, Nathan. Actually, before we move on to the panel session, obviously, I just want to invite Gavin.
Sorry, Gavin next.
A bit more specifically about the 2019 vintage, and also to tell us what is going on regarding En Primeur at the moment. What's happening? When's it going to happen? What should we expect?
Thanks, Tom. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
So, well, first of all, just by way of introduction, I'm Gavin Quinney, and this is 2019 was my 20th vintage in Bordeaux, working the vines, so I run a petit chateau, Château Bauduc, and so I have no sort of, I think Tom refers to it as skin in the game as far as En Primeur is concerned. I don't have any vested interest in En Primeur, but I'm a very interested spectator, both in terms of the vintage. You could look up my extremely interesting graphs and all sorts of data on gavinquinney.com. And if you just look under Bordeaux reports, you'll find lots of fascinating stuff about Bordeaux 2019 and previous vintages, including all the sort of weather stats and everything that you need to know about rainfall in any particular month in any given year. It's fascinating stuff. But I also taste the wine, so I'm rather disappointed not to have tasted the great wines of Bordeaux in my 20th vintage of En Primeur as yet. But I've been tasting. I don't, and I write the vintage report for Harper's Wine and Spirit, and obviously publish notes on things like Liv-Ex and stuff like that. So 2019 is a really, really good vintage, and therefore the En Primeur campaign should not, and the tastings should not be wasted, in my opinion. It's a terrific vintage. Character-wise, quite wet at the start, then a very hot, dry summer with rainfall at about the right time. Some sort of drought and heat spikes and so on, but good vintage conditions as well. Not the same as 18. There are some comparisons to 18, but I don't feel it's quite such a roasty, toasty vintage as 18, and I think that'll be sort of reflected in the wines. The wines are really good, and I think it's useful to point out, for as far as tasting is concerned, these wines, there is no rush. This is not a spring fashion collection that needs to be launched as soon as possible in terms of the wines. The wines will just improve in barrel all the way through to the final part of the élevage at the end of next spring, when the wines are taken out of barrel and blended, then bottled in the sort of summer of 2021. So there's plenty of time as far as the wines are concerned. I'm talking about the red wines primarily here. So we've got time on our hands. And we've also got to look at 19 in the context of, I think, we've had a run of good vintages. 18, there were some issues with 18 in terms of yields, possibly. You could argue that some of the effect of the spring mildew, the summer mildew, had quite an impact on the yields of some of the top chateaus. So there was some sort of variation in yields, but it was a very good quality vintage. 17, as we know, was sort of frost affected, so a little uneven, but very good still for sort of Saint-Julien, Pauillac and Saint-Estèphe, which was largely untouched by the April frost. And of course, 16, a much more consistently very, very good vintage, sound vintage. 15, another good vintage. I'd argue sort of probably better on the right bank and in places like Margaux, but so a little bit more variable, but another good vintage. And then 14 was a good vintage. So since what the Bordelais might call a challenging vintage of 2013, the tricky vintage of 2013, we've had a run of pretty good vintages. And I would say that 15, 16, 18 and now 19 are right up there. And 19 is a really, really good vintage. So we need to give it the sort of the quality factor. It's a really good vintage. So I was talking to just this afternoon with Ronan Laborde, who's the young and fairly dynamic president of the Union de Grand Cru. I had a long chat with him this afternoon, and he was of the same opinion as far as the tastings are concerned, which is, quote, the longer we leave it, the better. The wines will get better. So there's no rush to taste the wines. Of course, we're in a very extraordinary sort of situation. And as far as the primeurs is concerned, and again, his quote was, well, we were all in a fog about what to do. But we have to remember that he said it is in the DNA of the Bordeaux Grand Cru to have En Primeur. So I personally think the wines can wait, the tastings can wait, and we could leave it a whole year. That would be my argument. I think the En Primeur tastings are a terrific advert for Bordeaux. It gives the opportunity for so many people to come and visit Bordeaux. Thousands of people in the trade and press and commentators come to Bordeaux in early April, late March, and taste the wines. And I think what we'll see is a very different scenario now, with samples being dribbled out to journalists and so on. And I think, as Ronan said, really it is, he used the word opportunism, but it's different in French. What he actually said was the appetite. If the appetite is there for the wines to be released, for the market to be released, and obviously we're talking some time away now, not now, clearly not now. But when the appetite is there, then he thinks there will be, an En Primeur campaign. As I say, I personally would leave it because I think the campaign, the wines justify leaving this for a proper En Primeur tastings. But and then when we get into the autumn, everything is going to be backed up, not just Bordeaux En Primeur. Everything in our diaries is going to be backed up. There's going to be huge demand for people's time and interest as things go on. So, but I do now believe that when the appetite is there does seem to be although there's a lot of smaller chateaus sending out samples, and you can see that on Instagram and wherever, sort of people sending samples off to journalists. There does seem to be an appetite at the top end to be quite cohesive on this and launch a campaign when the moment is right. Whether that campaign would be successful is another matter, and some would argue about price. I would tend to concur with that for there to be any interest in the market. But it's all a bit up in the air at the moment, clearly. But there are some key meetings about to take place. One between the board members of the Union de Grand Cru. Then there's going to be meetings with the négociants. And I think if we saw interest and an appetite, as Ronan called it, an interest and appetite in the channel, that's the négociants, and then the merchants from around the world, then we will see a Bordeaux 2019 campaign.
Gavin, thank you very much indeed, both for your comments on the vintage and analysis of the current situation with regards to the release. It's obviously, I think, as you said, there's an awful lot up in the air, and this year more than ever, there's a number of obviously other and external contributing factors. Is this an opportunity for a reset in Bordeaux? And I'm inviting the panel generally to comment. I know the drinks business, Rupert, certainly had an opinion about Bordeaux En Primeur. Maybe you'd like to comment on
no, absolutely. I agree with Gavin very much. In fact, I spoke to him for an article that I wrote on this very subject. I think the En Primeur system, first and foremost, is great. I mean, I buy a little bit of Bordeaux every year, not anything hugely amazing, but I think when it works very well, and it would be both a shame for, I think, collectors and lovers of Bordeaux to lose the system as it stands, and also I think it would be very bad for the Château themselves to lose the system, because they do, I think, do very well out of it. That said, I really do believe there is an opportunity here to change the En Primeur system for the better. There have been some ideas that have been rolling around for a little while, with people saying it'd be better if we could taste the wines when they're just about to go into bottle, rather than as we now taste them, which is they're just sort of going into barrel sort of thing, or just in barrel. So very, very different. And I think that unless all the producers and so on, the collective Bordelais had a sort of Damascene conversion and just decided to change, there was no impetus to actually change it. I think now there is, with this situation, this sort of extraordinary situation. And I argued, partly on the back of speaking to Gavin, that I think that taking the 2019 wines and offering them at this time next year would be a very positive step in changing the En Primeur system, I think, in many ways for the better. And I think it would allow the wines to be tasted and assessed when they're ready to go into bottle, and they're sort of more finished wines. I think that helps the transparency of the system, which is very, very positive, and allows a better assessment and better communication from the trade and so on to collectors what these wines are actually like. And I think in a way as well, because what happens currently is obviously you pay your money and then you wait 2 years for the wine to arrive, and actually by moving it down the road 1 year, it becomes a little bit more like everything else. There's a much shorter distance, space of time between buying and receiving. And almost, if you look at the 2018s, look at what happened. Neil Martin wasn't there for various health reasons to assess the vintage at the time. Everyone else went in, there was some very gung-ho scores. And then when Neil Martin actually came to it later on in the year, he said, not sure about some of these wines, and if you'd actually bought one of those wines to the back of quite a gung-ho score, you might be feeling rather jaded about that. So I think, it shortens that. And also just in terms of, I think, immediate gratification, it might help a little bit if people felt that certainly younger audiences, I mean, something we talked about earlier, Nick, maybe we'll come to later, but maybe younger audiences might be a little more amenable to something like En Primeur if they realise that it's, you pay and then you get, fairly quickly, rather than waiting sort of 2 years. So I'm very much. Sorry.
One thing, Rupert, so just to consider though, I think that whilst it's a fascinating and potentially controversial idea to wait a whole year to release. I mean, Gavin, back to you as a Bordeaux winemaker as well as a commentator. I mean, that would have quite serious, potentially, if you were very involved in the En Primeur system, that would have quite serious financial implications for a number of chateaux. Is that sustainable? Is this something that we might see and we could consider?
I think I think we're unlikely to see it. I agree with Rupert. I think it's a terrific idea. Let's take time out. Let's say, okay, the Bordeaux En Primeur tastings and the campaign is something to really appreciate in a top vintage. And let's leave it a year, because one thing that the Bordeaux are very good at, very strong, and it's sort of underrated really, is élevage. It's the barrel aging. I mean, the money invested in these cellars is not just because they look pretty. The quality is there, and I think we'd see a lot of the arguments about early barrel samples and best barrels and all that sort of discussion, whatever the truth is behind that. I think a lot of that would be removed when you get close to the final blend before bottling. And that would just be 1 year on. And I agree with the sentiments that Rupert said. However, there'd be a lot of Bordeaux people who would argue strongly against that, right the way through the trade, the négociants especially. I think I don't think the top chateaus, would clearly the top chateaus could cope with a wait of a year without question. But there are a lot of properties that do rely on the En Primeur system. I think that's slightly risky. We've seen, for example, with Frost and Hale and World Events, relying on one vintage as your cash flow strikes me as a risky business. But the reality is I don't think we're going to see it, because I am a little bit convinced by what Ronan Laborde said this afternoon about the DNA of the Grand Cru of Bordeaux and the interest in selling the latest vintage.
Absolutely, and people do want to sell. So Nick, maybe moving to you, we haven't talked a great deal thus far about the actual consumer end of the process. So, I mean, is En Primeur still attractive to wine lovers, to consumers? How do you see things evolving on that front?
Well, I think the Bordelais need to figure out what En Primeur stands for. I think in the past it was very clear cut, which is that the négociants funded the new vintage. They did so at a discount to market value, and they passed some of that discount on to the enthusiastic Bordeaux wine lover and consumer, and that meant that the system worked very well. We're now in a world where price is used to justify expensive property purchases, and land values are correlated to release prices, and that's a tough one to break, since the 1855 classification was very much predicated on market price. But the truth of the matter is that the discount and the reason to buy early has gone out of the market. And so, I can see how attractive it would be to be able to release finished wines a year later and to offer that to the market just before they go into the bottle. But I'm not sure that it's En Primeur as we know it anymore. And I think the Bordelais need to figure out what it actually is for and how the En Primeur system can be used to engage consumers and inspire a new, younger generation of wine drinkers and lovers to fall in love with Bordeaux. And I don't think that they've figured that out at all right now. I think that they have notions about what being a brand means, but I think that they're confusing value and price.
And I think that's an important point, Nick, and one we'll return to, because I think I'd like to find out what exactly, or how we return to the initial appeal of En Primeur for the consumer. But just briefly, we've got a couple of interesting points and a question, in fact, from attendees. So Veronique Dos, who is the MD of Felin Segur, as I'm sure you know. Hello, Veronique. Thank you for joining us. Just mentions that sometimes you need to show the cake to make people hungry. And I think, in a way, that's certainly one thing we're lacking at the moment, of course, is it's very hard to get excited about about a vintage, about wines, which we have thus far been unable to start making opinions on. Margaret Rand, hello Margaret, again, thank you for joining us, has asked the question, or rather has posited the question after your suggestion, Gavin and Rupert, with En Primeur being delayed a year. Is this likely to benefit the Château, the negociants, or the consumers? I think that's a very interesting one, and one I'm sure everyone's got opinions on. But who will benefit the most from this delay?
Tom, can I just chip in with a couple of things, echo what Nick and Rupert have said in particular? I mean, firstly, as a collector, let's be honest, 5 out of the last 10 Bordeaux releases cost less to buy now than they did in En Primeur. So why, as an investor or a collector, and I'll come on to that part of the survey later, but why rationally would I buy a future in a wine that's still in barrel, hasn't been assembled, and 5 out of 10 times in the last 10 years, I could buy it cheaper by waiting to see what it's really like. And the other thing here, as a collector, you know, we're talking about Bordeaux 19. We've just been having a brilliant campaign of people buying Burgundy 18, Brunello 16, Barolo 16 and Brunello 15. The Italians have got it right, not the French, haven't they? Selling us wine that's in early maturity, or at least, you know, it's there ready to drink. And the whole Bordeaux En Primeur thing, as a consumer, as somebody who loves Bordeaux, it's a perfect question about who am I helping if I delay by a year. Of course, it's not helping the estates, it's helping consumers to understand the wine better. It's quite clear cut, surely.
Would anyone, well, Gavin as a producer, Nick as someone running the trading platforms, and Rupert as obviously as a commentator writer, would you agree? Or are there benefits for the negociants and for the chateaux?
I'd say, in answer to your question about who does it benefit, I think it would benefit everyone in the long term, especially Bordeaux. But I think it's a great idea to suspend it a year, but I just don't think it's going to happen. Sadly, the realities are that it's not going to happen. In terms of who it would benefit, I mean, it would be fantastic to go to the tastings when you're at the end of barrel aging and taste some of the lesser wines and actually think, gosh, you know, these are really pretty good. So I think it would benefit people right through the sort of spectrum of Bordeaux, certainly the sort of the quality value end of Bordeaux. I don't mean the cheap stuff. I mean the sort of unheralded lesser wines. What did Parker used to call them? You know, you know, but certainly the petit chateaux, I think would have more of a run into. That's not really my angle. I just think it would be in these extraordinary circumstances. It would be quite a good step to do that. I don't think it's going to happen. I think it will peter through in some way. I think there'll be the top chateaux to make some sort of campaign. I don't know about the timing. I don't know who can taste it, who will come. No one can travel at the moment. When will that happen? You know, but I think it'd be a great shame for a really good vintage like this not to make a stand and say, this is what we're going to do, and leave it a year. And then, if necessary, go back to the way it was. One thing to bear in mind is what we have now with this vintage, 2020, is without doubt an early start to the season. So ideas of having some tastings, for example, in early September, well, I think we're going to be picking in early September at the way things are going. So, you know, that would have been different in a normal vintage where you could say, come in the week of the Medoc Marathon or something, not that that's going to happen, but come in the early week of September and come and taste the wines. Well, right now, I think I'm pretty sure we're going to be picking in early September. It's a little bit like 2011 for those who remember early vintages. Yeah, that's 2020. So it would be a shame. Sorry.
Thank you, Gavin. Ruby, did you have a comment there, or?
Well, I mean, Gavin said what I was going to, which I think it benefits everyone. I think ultimately it does benefit the consumer more, because I think the consumer would get through merchants and through critics and so on, would get a better, fairer, far more accurate assessment of the wines of that particular vintage, which hopefully you you would think might be more of an incentive to buy, and therefore benefits the merchant négociant chateau all the way through the chain, because ultimately it's the end consumer who really makes the system. Really, that's the whole, should be the whole point of it.
Although interesting comment from Veronique on the Q&A here, that you're right, that just tasting it in a year, the wine will still be very young. My argument as a collector would be leave it 4 years to be Italian. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
I think leaving it 1 year might, it might be difficult enough. Another 4 or 5 might be near impossible. That's a small miracle, small step.
But her point is valid. The point is valid.
So there's a couple of linked questions before we move on, which there's a few questions we might not get around to answering in this panel session, but I'm sure we will in the second one. But a couple of linked questions. Miles is asking, how does Bordeaux recreate any hype other than a socking good vintage? And I think Michael slightly earlier asked the question or mentions that he's been buying En Primeur since 2012, but is becoming disillusioned with the pricing of the wine as it strikes him as greedy, the release prices, and he's now looking at different regions. We'll come on to other regions in the second panel, but can we take both those points to create? How do we recreate the allure and the appeal of buying Bordeaux En Primeur? Can we do it?
Can I have
Please,
a go at that?
Yeah.
So I think the first thing is let people taste some of the back vintages, more of the back vintages at the same time as the young vintages, to give them a sense of the glory of what great Bordeaux can be, and get back to the print. If you are going to carry on with En Primeur, get back to the base principles of making it worthwhile for the consumer to buy it early, or you just accept that the world has changed and you're not going to do that, and the pricing is going to be different, but then you have to release later. I don't think you can have both.
There was one last question I just wanted to ask that had appeared on the feed here, which would be interesting to know if Rupert, I'm sorry to point you out here, but you might know the stats. Someone else might know. But what percentage of premium Bordeaux wine is drunk in restaurants? So directly into the on-trade, and will this impact En Primeur price aspirations? Is that a link we can make between on-trade directly and En Primeur?
That's an interesting one. I think if there's one area which has sort of suffered from a bit of a lack of Bordeaux in more recent years, actually is the on-trade, funnily enough. Not too long ago, Bibendum launched, now got a little bit scotched up in the air due to current circumstances, but Michael Saunders from Bibendum, which is a big importer in the UK, was actually talking with chateau owners to get hold of ex-cellar stock at quite reasonable prices and offer it to sommeliers to then sell in restaurants and so on, because it is an area which I think Bordeaux has lost actually quite a lot of ground. Is the restaurants. I mean, yes, obviously there are very leading restaurants will have a lot of old very established Bordeaux, but there's quite a lot of other parts of Bordeaux, sort of certain other sort of maybe fourth, third, second growth, which are kind of a little bit lacking in the restaurant scene. How a lot of restaurants, the trouble is a lot of restaurants don't buy En Primeur, because unless a restaurant actually has a cellar to store stuff in, some do, most don't, they're buying through brokers anyway. So it's a world that it is difficult for them to play in generally. But I think Bordeaux is lacking from the restaurant scene. I think sommeliers are turning to other regions.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you, Rupert. So I think we'll move on now to our next section. Nathan, back to you. And the various implications
of over 100 people who've replied to our wine lovers survey. And to be honest, I think that's what Tom and Charlie and I are all about in Honest Grapes, is actually we're a wine club. And whilst the first half of this discussion has been very much from the point of view of what's going on in the trade, what's the disruption caused by COVID to the tasting and launch of the new Bordeaux 19, what I'd like to do is to show the results so far, the interim results of our survey, but I'm going to give my investor's eye view. And those of you who know me know that my main trade is as an early stage technology investor rather than a wine guy, although I've been collecting wine for nearly 30 years now. So I'm going to give a collector's view. I'm going to try and give an investor's view, although to be honest, I'm mainly a collector, but I do look after portfolios for people who are investing in wine. But above all, I want to give a realist's view. And I am so annoyed at the rubbish that's being spewed out by the trade at the moment. And I think, here are some quotes. These are directly from I'd say, other people, not from us, of course. I won't attribute them. But there are two things going on here. One of them is, you see the thing with satellite data, and I'm a satellite guy, so I like that sort of stuff, with people trying to pump up the vintage and keep us interested about how good 2019 will be as a vintage, to keep our interest while they don't have wine to sell us. And you can see satellite projections now being used to rank and mark almost as though these were Parker points or something. But then the other thing, and the thing I find really, really worrying, is people saying fine wine is a great alternative asset to be holding, and you should now be buying lots of fine wine and filling your cellar. And these quotes are directly from PR that we've received from other people. I've got to be honest, I am an investor, and actually real investors, and I hope we've got 100 or so real investors listening to this webinar. Real investors are saying I can buy quoted equities, and in my world of private equity, VC, and early stage angel investment, I can buy assets 30% cheaper than they were before Christmas. So why tell me about an asset that's preserved value? I should have bought it then, not now. Now is a time to be buying new assets. Just as I haven't poured opprobrium on the people who've said bad things, I said bravo to the person who wrote in the bottom left-hand corner here, debunking fine wine as a safe haven investment. The notion that it's a safe haven is misleading. So here are the preliminary results of our survey, over 100 people now. So this is the real voice of our membership base and those of you who've signed up for today. In general terms, is now a time to buy assets, sell, or sit on your hands. And you can see that roughly half of us are sitting on our hands, just under half of us are saying it's time to buy, and a small number are selling assets. And that reflects what's going on in our wine club. I'm sure, Nick, you'll have something to say about what's going on your platform later. I personally, as an early stage technology investor, I am now looking to buy assets. I'm tentative, we don't know where the bottom is, but there's lots of good statistics, there's lots of good history to say that buying VC, early stage, hedge fund, all these uncorrelated assets, the right time to buy it is just after the point of maximum pessimism. In order to get a calibration, we ask people, let's say, what are you as a buyer? And you can see that nearly half of the people who've answered the survey are people like me, I guess, who collect primarily, but because we're sort of financial people, we're interested in the value of the wine, we might sell a little bit. Bit of personal story here. I've only really sold 3 cases of wines I've ever bought. So I do add up the dollars, but I really buy it and collect it to drink. So I'm really in the second category as well, collecting for future drinking. About a sixth of the people who've answered the survey primarily see themselves as investors, and similarly about a sixth are not collecting wine, they're buying it to drink now. Then we ask people what proportion of your purchases are from the following regions. And what I've done here is I've matched the data against recent trading data from one of the main exchanges. And it shows you that our survey is a little bit less Bordeaux than the trades, but collecting and trading are somewhat different, and Bordeaux is more liquid. So you'd expect to see, as you can see on the brown there, the market share of trades is about 50% now in Bordeaux, whereas the share of the 100 or so people who've answered our survey is just under 40%. Yeah, and then you can see the rest slightly skewed, a bit more Burgundy in Italy, USA and other there. So now my top tips and my controversialist top tips. what would I advise myself really as a collector? And we've seen this. We saw a hiatus 3 or 4 weeks ago when lockdown started. Quite a few people just sat on their hands and missed their last bit of Burgundy 18, for example. Although we'd done very well, actually, as a collector, I do the following. I'd say if I'm really collecting, is the wine one I want in my collection? Would I regret missing it if somebody else snaffled it? Does it feel like a silly price that I'm not prepared to pay? I won't name the Italian Super Tuscan that was stupidly priced, and there's tons on the market. It'll be in the report. Okay, sorry guys, I'm sure you're listening. And is there so much made that if it'll go down in price if I wait? So the 5 out of 10 Bordeaux En Primeur vintages. But I would, as a collector, take opportunities to stock up on great vintages. And I would definitely, we have people in our club who've got really great opportunities. They've basically come in and hoovered up allocations of wines that they couldn't get for themselves normally because other people were scared a few weeks ago and they missed out. And wines like Harlan and Bond and some great really top grade Burgundy 18s and so on. Really, people have done really well on that. If they were follow the Warren Buffett thing, be greedy when other people are fearful. Be fearful when other people are greedy. Above all, drink some great bottles from your cellar. That's what it's there for. I'm on my Auberge Liberal 2000 here. For people whose primary motive is investing, my honest advice is firstly decide whether you've got bigger problems to worry about and reevaluate how much of your portfolio should be in alternative assets, such as wine. If you are sitting on a wine portfolio already, you will have benefited from its non-correlation or its lack of correlation with the financial markets. Thirdly, a big deal is access special situations, underpriced wines or wines where people are looking to offload them at somewhat lower than market prices. Tom and I are seeing plenty of opportunities in that area at the moment, and we're definitely accessing those for our club members, getting some really nice deals. Certainly look for the releases very carefully. Some releases will go through and will be sold. We had very successful launch of a wonderful new vintage 2015 of San Leonardo, and that's already sold about 1.5 times as much as the 2014 vintage. Maybe it's better timed because it was 3 weeks after the lockdown started, not the initial panic. Definitely look for those physical vintages if you're an investor. If other people have taken the pain, or the negociants still sitting on it, or collectors have got physical vintages, 5 out of 10 of the last En Primeur releases are now available at below their En Primeur release price. You can now buy that, and it's now more mature. There are more reviews of the physical wine. But as human beings, time to drink as well. Sit on your hands and follow 1D above. Back to you guys, the panel.
Nathan, thank you. Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself there. Thank you very much. That obviously thrown up a lot of conversation points. In terms of I suppose starting with Bordeaux before we move out, how do we make Bordeaux continue to be an important part of wine lovers' cellar plans, of wine collectors and investors' portfolios? Nick, what do we need? Looking historically back at times when there have been similar financial crises, what do we need to make Bordeaux attractive again?
Well, I think the market is doing that for us. So if you look back to, say, 1996 and the levels that first growths are trading at now there, we're pretty much back to the levels that we were at around the 2008 through 11 financial crisis. So I would argue that given those wines are truly great, now is a great time to be picking up back vintages like 1996, and the further back you go, the more you find yourself in markets that are becoming a little bit more scarcity-led, which I think Burgundy has demonstrated is not a bad place to be. And if we look at more recent vintages. I think a number of the panel members have talked about how great 2016 is and how it's perhaps priced below many of its release prices. Well, you know, whether today is the moment to do it, or whether it's worth waiting a month or three to see where that goes, I don't know. But clearly, focusing on great vintages where either the price hasn't moved or it's subsided is probably a sensible place to go. And then, you know, looking at some of the great successes in some of the vintages that are less obvious and where there's a big gap between the price of those wines and the prices of the same wines in more successful vintages, like, for example, 2011 Vieux Château Certain, which is, as you know, I'm drinking tonight, which is probably the last great Cabernet Franc vintage that VCC made, with 35% in the blend. The wine is extraordinary, and it is at a price that, frankly, is one-way bet.
And then I suppose broadening things out a bit now onto, you know, following on from Nathan's suggestions about wine collecting, whether for investing or for pleasure or a combination of the two. Rupert, maybe you could lead off with some of the other opportunities, the other regions that are beginning to attract attention for wine lovers and collectors.
No, absolutely. I mean, so every year that the magazine that I write for, the drinks business, we do at the end of the year a little roundup, well, a large roundup with Liv-Ex, the London International Vintners Exchange, and they kind of give us some data on what's been trading on their platform. It has to be said, currently, and it has fallen hugely, but 51% of the value of trades on Liv-Ex are still Bordeaux. So Bordeaux is still a huge part of the market. There's no denying that in any way. But there's no doubt, obviously, that the market has widened hugely, certainly even over the past year, let alone the past 10 years or so. Liv-Ex noted in 2019 that close to 7,000 different wines were trading on their platform, and in 2018 that had been 5,700. So there's a big leap in the number of wines being traded. Obviously, as Bordeaux's strength has waned, Burgundy has been a big thing that has crept up. I mean, I think, Nathan, the graph that you put together showing what people's cellars had in them is very illustrative of this. Obviously, Burgundy's come on hugely. Prices are a bit of an issue, obviously, with Burgundy now, particularly the very top end, because they're getting very high. But the Burgundy market is broadening as more people are looking at different producers to fill those sort of gaps. Champagne has risen hugely as a collectible thing, and Champagne really works. It works a bit like Bordeaux. It's got huge brand power. It's very accessibly priced. I mean, Dom Perignon or Cristal, you're paying max maybe £2,000 a case. Perhaps even less, £1,000 as an entry price. That's, for that quality of wine, very, very good, and the distribution is incredible. Champagne, and then I think, but Italy is the big one that has caught people's attention of late. In particular, Tuscan wines, Super Tuscans in particular, Brunellos to a point, perhaps not hugely in the UK. US has always been a big Brunello market, and I think Piedmont, we're still only really scratching the surface of Piedmont. I think it has a huge amount of fans, enthusiasts, and the thing is, they buy us. But some of these wines are produced in tiny quantities, even less than certain Burgundies. So if demand goes up for some of those Barolos in particular, I mean, prices could go completely insane. We're not there yet. It is beginning slowly but surely. And then other than that, I do think the US wines have caught a little bit of wind in the UK for the first time in a while, particularly slightly more sort of classic nappers like Bond and Harlan, Ridge, things like that. Maybe not Screaming Eagle so much. And then the rest of the world, there's a few bits and bobs floating around. I mean, Spain has Vega Sicilia and Pingus, but Spain's hugely underrated as a fine wine nation, sadly. And after that, one thing that is, I think, coming up might be, and something the Bordeaux Negociants are actually doing now in September. Obviously, they are becoming the main channel for a lot of these American wines and Super Tuscans and South American wines coming to the market, you know, Almaviva, Senya, Catena Zapata, things like that. But thereabouts, yeah.
Ruben, thanks so much. And Nick, are you seeing these increasing trends towards other regions? Is that reflected on your platform? Are you seeing people trading these wines, showing more interest in these wines? And if so, where as well?
For sure, yes, is the answer. I think, you know, it's worth saying that the first growth Bordeaux is still probably where the greatest liquidity is. So don't get into a diversified wine collection if liquidity is your priority. You probably want to be investing in other things for liquidity. So let's assume that this is the fringe of your wealth, that it's discretionary, and that it's therefore an area that is not paramount about being able to liquidate quickly if you want, if you need to. That's not where it is. So having said that, I think the biggest action right now is in Piedmont, and I think that it's a great beneficiary of global warming. I think, you know, going back over the last, say, 40 years, you'd have gone through decades like the 70s and 80s and maybe even the 90s where it was patchy, that one vintage versus another would be tricky in terms of being able to reach full maturity, and now the opposite problem exists, which is that classic vintages like 13 and 16 are those that are really sought after, and warm vintages, you know, perhaps like 15 and 17 are becoming trickier, and that's opening up some of the parts of Piedmont outside of Barolo and Barbaresco perhaps wouldn't have been looked at before. But overall, it is a beneficiary of global warming. It's probably 10 years behind Burgundy. There is a renaissance in terms of quality of winemaking. There are many small producers making very small quantities of individual crus, and I think, you know, the fundamentals are there for that to be a very interesting area for people to buy into today, and to be able to buy in at an accessible level. And whether you're a wine lover or an investor, it's going to be a smart thing to do, because you're going to be either drinking great wine that you bought at a fraction of the price of their current value, or you're going to be sitting on a really nice part of your portfolio that's increased in value.
Nice. Thank you, Nick. And I suppose before we draw things to a close, I suppose I should give you last word, Gavin. We've broadened the discussion away from Bordeaux, but bringing it back. You know, why should we still be in love with Bordeaux? What is the allure? You know, why should we be focusing on Bordeaux even now?
Well, right now, I think I've got a glass of rosé 2019, but really, red Bordeaux at all price points, I think, is a great bottle of wine for you and your partner, or on your own, to enjoy in these sort of lockdown times, and at all price points, from sort of the petit chateaus that offer great value, and if we look back, I mean, you know, Nick was talking about 2011, albeit via Château Certain, but you know, 2011 at the time was you know, it was sort of rather overlooked as a vintage, and now those rather tough tannins have all softened, and there are some really delicious wines out there from vintages like 2011, certainly 2012, 2014s, and the younger 16s. There's volume and there's quality, and most of it was completely really ignored by the En Primeur campaign. It was the En Primeur campaign which is really, really important in terms of those tastings as a great advert for Bordeaux, the great names. And we love talking about Cheval Blanc and Lafite and Latour and Mouton and all of them. We love talking about that and going to visit those places. But really there is so much value in Bordeaux right across the spectrum, and I'm going to carry on drinking the stuff.
Good for you. Gavin, thank you very much. Well, I'm going to draw things to a close now, as we've hit 7:30. If anyone wants to stay on and ask a few more questions, that's fine. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you very much for our panelists as well, of course, and to Nathan as well for the analysis. In case anyone who's still on here has yet to fill out either of the surveys, either the professional survey or the wine lovers survey, then it would be great if you do, because it will make the data that we can send on to everyone even more complete. And we will send out the completed report, I think next week, or certainly as soon as we can collate everything. I hope you'll agree it's been a fairly frank and at times illuminating exchange, and kind of once again exposes the tension around Bordeaux between our love of the wines and questions, perhaps even concerns about how it's released and how it's priced. Will things return to the new normal, or could COVID-19 and Bordeaux-19 usher in long-lasting changes to the system? We shall see. Just remains for me once again to thank all the panelists and attendees, to remind all of you that we have some more events coming up. We have our Premier Crew Club evening on the 22nd next week with our special guest Jane Eyre from Burgundy. The 23rd, Around the World in 48 Wines, Global Pinots, Burgundy and Beyond. And on the 29th, Meet the Grower with our dear friend Clemens Bush, master of the Moselle. So once again, thank you so much all for joining us. Really appreciate everyone turning up this evening. Hope you've drunk well, and look forward to seeing you for another wine therapy session very soon. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.